They say your life flashes before your eyes when you die. Mine did. 10 years of a loveless marriage, bankruptcy, and Marcus's cold laugh as I took my last breath. So when I woke up back on that departing train, his hand desperately reaching for mine, I simply waved goodbye. The shrill, piercing whistle of the 4:15 p.m. express train from Windermere tore through the damp autumn air, vibrating against my eardrums. I blinked, the sudden rush of freezing rain hitting my cheeks like a spray of glass. The metallic scent of diesel and wet asphalt filled my lungs. I gasped, my hands flying to my chest, expecting to feel the agonizing, rattling wheeze of untreated pneumonia. I expected to see the peeling gray wallpaper of the unheated hospice room in East London, where I had drawn my final, pathetic breath just seconds ago. Instead, I saw a polished mahogany doorframe. I felt the rumble of a heavy locomotive engine beneath my leather boots. I was standing in the open doorway of a first-class carriage. The train was already moving. "Leora, reach out, pull me up." The voice sent a violently cold shockwave down my spine. It was a voice I had spent 10 years learning to fear, to placate, to beg for scraps of affection. I looked down. Running alongside the accelerating train was Marcus Pendleton. He looked so devastatingly young. The harsh lines of cruelty that would eventually carve his face in my past life were gone. He was 25, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that was currently getting ruined by the Lake District rain. His right hand was outstretched toward me, frantic and demanding. But his eyes weren't on me. They kept darting back over his shoulder toward the muddy banks of the River Kent, just beyond the iron railings of the platform. There she was, Isabella Montgomery. She was kneeling in the mud, shivering in a thin silk dress, entirely inappropriate for October, sobbing theatrically with one hand pressed against her forehead. The memories of my past life slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. In that life, this was the defining moment. In that life, I had panicked. I had lunged forward, hooking my arms under Marcus's armpits, screaming from the strain as my rotator cuff tore, dragging him onto the moving train just before the platform ended. I had saved him. I had comforted him while he stared blankly out the window, his mind entirely consumed by the fact that he had left Isabella behind. I married him a year later. I poured my inheritance, the entire liquid capital of Evans Holdings, into his failing tech startup, Pendleton Dynamics. I worked 90-hour weeks to build his empire. And what was my reward? The moment his company went public, he transferred 80% of the voting shares into a shell corporation owned by Isabella. He froze my accounts. He locked me out of my own family's legacy. When I fell ill, he refused to authorize my medical insurance. "You forced me onto that train, Leora," he had whispered into my ear as I lay dying in that hospice, his eyes utterly dead. "You tore me away from the only woman I ever loved. You bought my body, but you never owned my soul. Consider this your final bill." A sharp jolt of the carriage snapped me back to the present. The train was picking up speed. The end of the concrete platform was rapidly approaching. "Leora, damn it, what are you doing? Grab my hand!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with panic. He was struggling to keep pace, his leather soles slipping dangerously on the wet asphalt. He looked at me, genuine confusion replacing his entitlement. I looked at his outstretched fingers, the very fingers that would one day sign the papers, ordering the foreclosure of my childhood home. I stepped back from the edge of the doorway. I didn't say a word. I simply looked him dead in the eyes, folded my arms across my chest, and gave him a slow, chilling smile. Marcus's eyes went wide. The confusion morphed into sheer, unadulterated terror. He lunged, but his fingers only brushed the cold metal of the doorframe. "No, Leora!" The automatic doors hissed shut, sealing with a heavy, satisfying thud. Through the reinforced glass, I watched Marcus stumble, lose his footing, and crash hard onto the rain-slicked platform. He rolled, tearing the knees of his expensive trousers, and slid right to the very edge of the platform as the train roared past him. I stood by the window, watching his figure grow smaller and smaller. He scrambled to his knees, staring after the train in absolute disbelief. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the riverbank. Isabella was still there, crying in the mud. He had wanted to stay for her. Well, now he had his wish. I walked back to my plush velvet seat, my legs shaking so violently I practically collapsed into the cushion. I pressed my trembling hands against my face, half expecting to wake up back in the hospice. But the warmth of the carriage, the soft jazz playing over the intercom, the steady thrum of the wheels, it was all real. It was the 14th of October, 2016. I had returned. I was 24 years old again, the sole heir to the Evans fortune, and I was entirely, beautifully free. A manic laugh bubbled up from my chest, echoing in the empty first-class cabin. I laughed until tears streamed down my face. I had spent 10 years trying to prove to Marcus that I was worthy of his love. I had believed his lies that Isabella was just a fragile friend who needed his help. I had driven myself into an early grave carrying the weight of his incompetence and his infidelity. Never again. I pulled my phone from my trench coat pocket. I had exactly 2 hours before this train pulled into London Euston. 2 hours to dismantle the life I had meticulously built for a man who despised me. I dialed the number of my father's lead attorney, Richard Gable. "Leora? Good afternoon," Richard's crisp, professional voice answered. "I assume you and Marcus are on your way back from the retreat? Are we proceeding with the drafting of the marriage settlement and the £5 million capital injection for Pendleton Dynamics?" "Cancel it," I said, my voice eerily calm. A long pause hung on the line. "Cancel. Which part exactly?" "All of it, Richard. The marriage settlement is dead. The capital injection is permanently revoked. Furthermore, I want you to immediately audit all joint ventures between Evans Holdings and the Pendleton family. Freeze any credit lines extended to Marcus." "Leora, are you sure? The contract for the Pendleton Tech Incubator is due to be signed tomorrow morning. If we pull out now, Marcus's company will face immediate insolvency. He is heavily leveraged against a mezzanine loan from Sterling Reed Partners." I smiled, looking out the window at the rolling green hills of the English countryside. I knew exactly who Sterling Reed Partners were. They were managed by Dominic Reed, a ruthless private equity shark who was infamous in the city of London for stripping bankrupt companies for parts and leaving the founders with nothing but staggering debt. In my past life, my £5 million had saved Marcus from Dominic Reed's jaws. "I am entirely sure, Richard," I replied. "Let Dominic Reed have him." When I stepped off the train at London Euston, the air felt lighter, cleaner. My phone had been vibrating non-stop for the last 40 minutes. 62 missed calls. 50 from Marcus, 12 from his mother, Victoria Pendleton. I turned the device off entirely and hailed a black cab to my penthouse in Mayfair. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in swift corporate execution. I didn't shed a single tear. The grief had been burned out of me in my previous life. Now, there was only cold, calculated logistics. I spent Monday morning in the boardroom at Canary Wharf with my CFO, Simon Hewitt, aggressively severing every financial tie to the Pendleton family. We pulled our sponsorships from Victoria Pendleton's charity galas. We canceled the luxury fleet leases under Marcus's name that my company had been silently footing the bill for. I was systematically dismantling the invisible scaffolding of wealth that held the Pendleton name up. By Tuesday afternoon, the shockwaves had hit. I was sitting at my mahogany desk, reviewing the Q3 earnings reports, when the heavy glass doors of my office violently swung open. My assistant, a terrified-looking young woman named Sarah, was practically pushed aside as Marcus stormed into the room. He looked horrendous. The perfectly coiffed, arrogant golden boy of London high society was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and unshaven.
He was wearing the same suit from 2 days ago, now dry but permanently stained with Lake District mud.
He smelled faintly of cheap gin and damp wool. "Leave us, Sarah," I said calmly, not looking up from my iPad. The doors clicked shut. Marcus marched up to my desk and slammed his hands down on the polished wood, leaning over me with a look of murderous fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. "Are you psychotic? You left me at the station. You let the train leave without me." I slowly set my iPad down, folded my hands together, and met his furious gaze with absolute stillness. "You were reaching for my hand, Marcus, but you were looking at Isabella," I said softly. "I simply made the executive decision to grant you your heart's desire. You wanted to stay with her by the river. I let you stay. You should be thanking me."
His jaw worked furiously, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. She was having a severe panic attack, Leora. She could have thrown herself into the freezing water. I had to make sure she was safe, but you were supposed to wait. You were supposed to hold the doors, you vindictive, jealous bitch. I let out a soft, genuine chuckle. The sound seemed to unnerve him entirely. He blinked, the anger faltering for a split second as he registered that I wasn't crying. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't playing the role of the hysterical, insecure fiancé he was so used to managing. "There are no emergency stops on the Windermere Express for a man who can't make up his mind," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. "How is Isabella, by the way? Did she enjoy the rain?" Marcus ran a trembling hand through his ruined hair. He began pacing the length of my office, his breathing erratic. "We were stranded. The last train was canceled because of a signal failure. We had to spend the night in a wretched, freezing bed and breakfast. My cards were declined, Leora. My cards. I had to pawn my Rolex just to get us a taxi back to London this morning." "Ah, yes, the cards. That brings us to the actual reason you're standing in my office looking like a vagrant," I said smoothly. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up an email from Richard Gable. "Your corporate Amex, your Coates account, and the line of credit at Barclays. They were all guaranteed by Evans Holdings. Since our engagement is canceled, those guarantees have been withdrawn." Marcus froze mid-step. He slowly turned to face me, the color draining from his face so fast I thought he might faint. "What did you just say?" "I said the engagement is off, Marcus, and so is the £5 million investment into Pendleton Dynamics." "You can't do that," he exploded, lunging toward the desk again. "The contracts were drawn up. We practically shook on it. If you pull that funding, Dominic Reed will execute the penalty clause on my mezzanine loan. He'll seize my intellectual property. He'll liquidate my entire company by Friday. Then I suggest you stop standing in my office and start looking for a new angel investor," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "Perhaps Isabella has a spare $5 million lying around. She certainly dresses like it." Marcus stared at me, his chest heaving. He was searching my face for the bluff, for the crack in my armor. He expected me to leverage this. He expected me to say, "I'll save you, but you have to cut Isabella off forever." That's what the old Leora would have done. That's what I did in my past life, buying his loyalty while his heart remained with her. "This is about her, isn't it?" he sneered, a desperate, arrogant smirk trying to form on his lips. "You're throwing a multi-million-pound tantrum because I showed a shred of humanity to another woman. You're trying to financially blackmail me into marrying you. It's pathetic, Leora." I stood up. I was wearing 4-inch Louboutins, bringing me almost to his eye level. I walked around the desk, stopping just inches from him. He smelled of desperation. "Marcus," I whispered, keeping my tone terrifyingly polite. "I don't want you anymore. I wouldn't marry you if you were the last breathing man in England. The money isn't a bargaining chip to win you back. It's a wall to keep you out." I watched the arrogance shatter in his eyes. For the first time, reality truly set in. What Marcus didn't know yet, what he wouldn't figure out until it was far too late, was the truth about his precious, fragile Isabella. In my past life, because I had funded Marcus, Isabella had leached off him comfortably. But Isabella Montgomery was not a tragic muse. She was a professional grifter in deep, dangerous debt to an underground gambling syndicate in Soho, run by a man named Mickey Sullivan. She had staged the entire breakdown by the river. She had tracked Marcus to the Lake District, knowing he was about to secure my millions, playing on his savior complex to trap him. She thought she was hooking a billionaire.
Instead, thanks to me leaving him on that platform, she had just hooked a man who was utterly broke, drowning in private equity debt, and about to be hunted by Dominic Reed's lawyers. "You have 30 seconds to leave my building," I told him, walking over to the heavy oak door and pulling it open, "before I have security forcefully drag you out by the collar of your cheap, muddy suit." Marcus stood paralyzed in the center of the room. "You'll regret this," he stammered, his voice devoid of its usual power, sounding like a frightened child. "When I build this company, when I succeed without you, you'll regret this." "I look forward to watching," I said. As he shuffled out of the office, broken and bewildered, I felt a thrill of dark, absolute euphoria rush through my veins. The game hadn't even truly begun, and Marcus Pendleton was already bleeding, and I was going to ensure that Isabella was the one holding the knife. 6 weeks later, the corporate slaughter of Pendleton Dynamics was complete. It was a Tuesday morning when Dominic Reed's lawyers descended upon Marcus's glass-paneled offices in Shoreditch like vultures to a fresh carcass. I watched the live footage from my tablet in the back of my chauffeured Bentley. Dominic had texted me a secure link to the security feeds, a professional courtesy between sharks. Marcus was physically dragged out of his own boardroom by private security. He was kicking and screaming, his designer tie ripped, clutching a useless briefcase of invalidated patents. Dominic had executed the penalty clause perfectly. Without my £5 million safety net, Marcus was in breach of contract. Sterling Reed Partners seized the intellectual property, liquidated the hardware assets, and saddled Marcus with £3 million of outstanding corporate liabilities that he had foolishly personally guaranteed. He was legally, utterly bankrupt. I set my tablet face down on the leather seat and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The first phase of my past life trauma had been avenged. But the second phase, the Isabella phase, was entirely out of my hands. I had merely set the stage. She was the one holding the match. According to the private investigators I had hired, Marcus's descent into hell began that very night. Stripped of his company, his penthouse locked down by bailiffs, and his bank accounts frozen, Marcus had nowhere to turn but to his tragic muse. He took the tube likely for the first time in his adult life to Isabella's flat in Camden. He expected sanctuary. He expected the fragile, devoted woman he had chosen over me by the riverbank to wrap her arms around him and tell him they would rebuild together. Instead, he found the front door of her flat kicked off its hinges. When Marcus stumbled inside, Isabella wasn't crying delicately into a silk handkerchief. She was backed into a corner of her trashed living room, screaming hysterically while two heavily tattooed enforcers systematically smashed her furniture with baseball bats. Sitting in the center of the room, calmly smoking a cigar, was Mickey Sullivan. Mickey ran a notorious underground gambling syndicate in Soho. He didn't care about tech startups or high society galas. He cared about the £250,000 Isabella owed him from a year-long roulette bender. Marcus, still clinging to his desperate savior complex, tried to intervene. He puffed out his chest, using his best aristocratic voice, demanding the thugs leave his girlfriend alone, promising that he was Marcus Pendleton and he would cover her debts. Mickey had simply laughed. He knew exactly who Marcus was. The entire financial district knew Marcus was ruined. "You're not a white knight, mate," Mickey reportedly told him, blowing smoke into Marcus's face. "You're just the mark she thought could pay me off. But since your pockets are empty, you're just collateral." They beat Marcus until his ribs fractured. They broke 2 fingers on his right hand, the same hand he had reached out to me with on the train platform. Isabella didn't try to stop them. In fact, while Marcus was bleeding on the cheap linoleum floor, coughing up blood and begging for help, Isabella packed a duffel bag with whatever jewelry she had left and slipped out the fire escape, abandoning him to the wolves. She disappeared into the London Underground, fleeing the country to avoid Mickey's wrath, leaving Marcus to take the fall for her debts. The woman he had sacrificed his empire for hadn't loved him. She had only seen him as an ATM, and when the machine declined, she left him for dead. Over the next 4 months, Marcus's reality fractured. The physical injuries healed, but the psychological shatter was permanent. He couldn't grasp how his golden life had evaporated. He tried to sue Dominic Reed, representing himself, because no lawyer would take his case without a retainer. He was laughed out of the high court. He tried to crawl back to his mother, Victoria, but my systematic withdrawal of Evan's Holdings support had triggered a domino effect. The Pendleton family estate was heavily mortgaged, and the bank foreclosed on their ancestral home in Surrey right before Christmas. Victoria moved to a small flat in Wales, refusing to speak to the son who had ruined their family name. Every bridge he had ever built had been burned to ash, and I hadn't even struck the match. I had simply stopped shielding him from the fire. Winter gave way to a wet, biting spring. My company, Evans Holdings, reported record-breaking first-quarter profits. I had acquired 3 new tech startups, competent, brilliant companies run by founders who actually understood code, not just marketing and manipulation. I was thriving. The ghost of my past life's sickness and despair had vanished completely. It was late April when I saw him for the final time. I had just finished a charity dinner at the Savoy Hotel. The rain was coming down in sheets, a torrential downpour that mirrored the day at the Windermere station. My driver had pulled the Rolls-Royce up to the curb, holding a heavy black umbrella over my head as I descended the marble steps. Leora. The voice was a hoarse, rattling croak. It barely pierced the sound of the driving rain. I stopped. Standing just outside the glow of the hotel's brass lanterns, leaning heavily against a wrought iron fence, was a man. For a second, I didn't recognize him. He was emaciated, his cheekbones jutting out sharply through pale, dirty skin. His hair was long, greasy, and matted against his skull. He was wearing a filthy, oversized trench coat that offered no protection against the cold. It was Marcus. My security detail instantly stepped forward, forming a wall between us, but I raised a gloved hand to stop them. I stepped closer to the edge of the awning, looking down at the absolute ruin of the man who had once been my executioner. He was trembling violently. His eyes, once sharp and arrogant, were dilated and completely unhinged. They darted wildly, tracking invisible threats in the shadows before snapping back to my face. "I waited," he mumbled, his jaw shivering. "I waited by the river. You told me to stay by the river." A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't entirely present. The stress, the beatings, the total annihilation of his ego had broken his mind. "I didn't tell you to stay, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice devoid of pity. "I let you choose. You chose Isabella." At the sound of her name, a violent spasm racked his thin frame. He clutched his head with both hands, his broken fingers bent at odd angles. She wasn't real. She was a trap. Mickey Sullivan. The bats. The blood. He started hyperventilating, backing away from me, his boots splashing in the deep puddles. She took the money. No, there was no money. Dominic took the money. He suddenly lunged forward, throwing himself against the chest of my largest bodyguard. The guard easily shoved him back, sending Marcus sprawling onto the wet pavement. "It was a mistake!" Marcus screamed from the ground, the sound tearing from his throat in an agonizing wail. He looked up at me, tears streaming through the grime on his face. "Pull me up, Leora! Please, I'm reaching for you. Just pull me onto the train. I'm sorry. I'll leave her. I'll leave her by the river. Just pull me up." He extended his right hand toward me, his twisted, improperly healed fingers stretching through the pouring rain. It was an exact, grotesque mirror of that day at Windermere Station. Only this time, there was no train. There was no Isabella. There was only the cold, unforgiving pavement of the life he had built for himself. I looked at his outstretched hand. I thought of the 10 years of agonizing subservience in my past life. I thought of the cold hospice room, the bankruptcy, and the cruel laugh he had given me as I died. I stepped out from under the umbrella, letting the rain wash over my designer gown, standing fully in the light so he could see my face clearly. "The train has already left, Marcus," I whispered. I turned my back on him. I didn't look over my shoulder as I climbed into the warm, illuminated sanctuary of the Rolls-Royce. The door shut with a heavy, final thud. As the car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly into the London night, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Marcus was still on his knees in the pouring rain, screaming at an empty street, his hand desperately reaching out to a ghost that would never, ever pull him up. Did Leora's revenge satisfy your craving for absolute justice? If you loved watching Marcus's arrogant empire crumble and seeing him get exactly what he deserved, hit that like button and share this story with anyone who loves a brilliant, ruthless comeback. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next high-stakes tale of betrayal and redemption. Tell me in the comments, did she go too far or not far enough?